encourage your soul, enlighten your mind, and empower your faith. This is the Light Network. Welcome back to Preachers in Training. I'm Robert Hatfield. This is the podcast on which we discuss all things preaching and ministry. We're coming to you once again on this episode from the exhibit hall floor at Polishing the Pulpit in Sevierville, Tennessee. Great opportunity to sit down with some folks with whom we might not typically get to physically sit down together. And that's the case with our guest today. Brother Dean Miller and I cross paths from time to time, but very rarely have we gotten the opportunity just to sit down and chat. And I'm grateful for that. Welcome, brother. We're glad that you're here.
Thanks, Robert, for the invitation. I really appreciate this because this is a special topic to talk about, a neglected topic. So I'm thrilled with any opportunity to get my foot in the door. Yeah.
Your ministry is so important. We're talking today about ministering to widows and widowers, and you're the fellow that I thought about because of your focus in your ministry on widowhood. Talk to us about what you do.
The Widowhood Workshop Ministry came as a result of, it was my family's reaction to the death of my wife, the death of their mother, their mother-in-law, their Nana. You know, we don't have control over our circumstances a lot of times in life, but we always have the ability to react. That's in our control, to react to circumstances. And what we wanted to do is try to do the best we can to make people aware of the impact of loss in a person's life and a family's life, and how that affects us, and help them become more knowledgeable about how to effectively and safely navigate the storm that loss is. And Robert, I think one thing that's really good to mention at the outset is there's a big difference between a person experiencing loss and then a person living with that loss every day and every night afterwards. You know, when I lost my wife, I had been with the same church for 32 years in Hartville, Ohio.
Oh, wow.
And during that period of time, I was with a lot of people who experienced great loss. I was in their presence pre-loss, at loss, and right afterwards. What I'd learned during those 32 years was what a tremendously challenging and painful thing that it was to lose somebody that you love dearly. But what I was clueless of was what it was like to live with that loss. After the funeral, everybody goes back to their normal. Well, to put it bluntly, there ain't no normal for the spouse who's lost a beloved husband or wife. And I didn't realize that. I can even publicly at this format confess my neglect. I ministered to those folks who were losing their spouses and then lost their spouse, but only up into the immediate time after the loss. The reason why I neglected them, it was because I was both ignorant and inexperienced. I was ignorant of what their life was like afterwards. I had never experienced it. So when you put ignorance and inexperience together, that equals neglect. And so I admit the fact that I neglected the widowed community, even in my church family that I love dearly. It wasn't an intentional thing. It was just something that happened because I didn't know. And also, a lot of times in the church, we don't have a level and quality of fellowship where we will admit what's really going on in our life and how we really feel. We sometimes, I guess out of common courtesy, maybe contemporary cultural courtesy, when somebody asks us, well, how are you doing? And they're asking because they know that we've recently lost a husband or a wife. And our response is, okay, or fine. When actually that's not true. I'm not suggesting it's a bold-faced lie, but I'm simply suggesting that it is a compassionate response to that question, and we have a hard time admitting the fact that we're struggling. And the vast majority of people who lose their spouse struggle mightily for a lot longer than we ever imagined, unless we've experienced it in our past. And so I really, because I didn't know, I didn't understand the need to cultivate a community among the widowed people in my church family, and for that matter, in the community. Every community has widowed people, just like every church has widowed people.
Yeah.
And I'm not suggesting those people become a clique, but what I am suggesting is there's a natural community there because they have a common bond. That common bond is loss. And loss doesn't get much worse than the loss of a beloved spouse.
Yeah.
So it's a gut-wrenching experience that not only do you feel the immediate pain, but then you have to deal with the reality of this gift, quote unquote, that life gave you that you don't want.
Right.
But you're not about to re-gift it to somebody. And you can't put it in a closet and forget about it like we do with gifts we're given that we don't want. And then find it 20 years later when we choose to move from that place.
You're right.
We get that gift out and then we say, man, that was the ugliest thing I've ever been given. You know, you can't do that with loss.
Yeah.
You know, you can't return it. You don't want to re-gift it. You can't hide it. You've got to learn to deal with it. And it's very difficult to learn to deal with. And I frankly just did not know that until I experienced it.
Mm-hmm.
Robert, I even contributed to neglecting my own mother. When I had promised my dad, Dad, if you die because of this surgery, I'll make sure Mom's taken care of. Mm-hmm. And so I did the things that we naturally think about. If she needed somebody to go to the doctor with her,
right.
I went. Yeah. She had the best looking lawn on the street. Now, I'm a recovering control freak and borderline OCD, and I really took a lot of pride in how her yard looked.
Sure.
But what I didn't realize was what she needed most. Wasn't her yard cut perfectly, or even somebody to go to the doctor with her. What she needed most was me. Mm. She needed people, and most importantly, she needed her family. She needed her kids and her grandchildren. Mm. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 3 through 16, you've got a passage there, a lengthy passage about the caring for or honoring the widowed.
Yeah.
And that care, that honor there is in the present tense. It's talking about a continual action. And that consistent caring for the widowed is something that is first and foremost to be embraced by the children of those parents and grandparents who are widowed. Mm-hmm. Well, how can I possibly minister to somebody when I don't know a thing about what they're going through?
Yeah.
I'd never experienced it myself. And here's another confession for you. I guess I'm going to walk out of your booth pretty clean here. I have to admit, I never read a book about widowhood. I never preached a sermon about widowhood in my entire local preacher ministry of over 40 years.
Well, you might define like widows indeed, and who that doesn't mean or something like that. But you're not, even that's not speaking in a way that ministers to those who are widows.
Exactly.
That's just defining some terms.
Yeah.
Who are we on the hook for or off the hook for?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think one reason why we need to become more aware of the life of the widowed is because if in the church family, we're going to help our families be the first line of ministry for the widowed, and the first line of ministry is not the church, it's the family. Now, you also have to admit, though, we've got dysfunction in families.
Right.
So what about those widowed who are neglected by their families because their family is basically dysfunctional? But what we need to do in the church is we need to openly talk about and study about the life of the widowed, among other things, to help families understand what their parents and grandparents are going through when they lose their spouse.
Yeah.
Because I can't minister to somebody I don't know anything about what they're going through.
Yeah.
So that's why I think this subject is so important.
Yeah. And so often in ministry, like you say, you walk with people during the immediacy of the loss, and then maybe unintentionally, maybe like you said, there's ignorance, I don't really know what to do, but also, well, here's another family that is now going through some loss, and your attention just shifts away. Mm-hmm. You may try and catch up with them at worship services, but then you're met with the I'm fine, okay, and if you see them, okay, they're coming to worship, they're coming to Bible class, they seem to be plugged in, they say they're fine, they must be handling this okay. There's no way somebody is just okay when their entire world has just been rocked. And then they're learning like, well, here's what my spouse used to do, that he or she used to pay all the bills. He or she used to, they were the person who were in charge of this, and this. And now I'm trying to put their pieces together and do investigative work to realize maybe what all they did that I didn't appreciate. That's hard to do.
Yeah, and the biggest loss, now you obviously have this vacuum created by the fact that you've lost your spouse. So whatever role they played in your marriage, then there's a vacuum created there, so there's a need. But the biggest vacuum is the relational vacuum.
Right, just not there.
When I go out and do these Living with Loss workshops, during the course of those workshops, I always ask at some point in time, and I make sure I do it in a tone of voice and with the right words so that I don't lead them to answering in a certain way that I want them to answer. So I will raise this question. I will say, what in our culture nowadays do we commonly associate with widowhood? When you think about widowhood, life after the loss of your spouse, in our culture, what do we commonly associate with that? Well, guess what is 99% of the time the first thing that's mentioned? It's loneliness. That's what they associate. Now, I did have one time in Medina, Ohio, where this guy raised his hand about halfway back on the right-hand side of the auditorium, and I said, I happen to know him personally. I said, okay, Denny, get us started. What do we commonly associate with widowhood? And he said, old.
Old.
And I said, well, yeah, Denny, you're right about that. However, you don't have to be old to experience widowhood.
Right.
And then I proceeded to explain that though we typically think about people being widowed in their 60s, 70s, or 80s, in the United States, the average age of a woman when she's first widowed isn't even in the 60s.
Is that right?
It's 57.
Wow.
Now, with all the bulk of the 60s, 70s, 80s spouses who lose their spouses, how many younger spouses would you have to experience spousal loss to drive that number all the way down to 57? It's a thing that can happen to anybody. The only thing you have to do to become a prospective widow is just say, I do.
Yeah.
The only people who can be widowed is people who are married. And when I do these workshops, these Living with Loss workshops, and by the way, the ministry has a website, it's widowhoodworkshop.com.
Good, thanks.
We also have a public Facebook page. It's 3 words, Widowhood Workshop Ministry. That's a public Facebook page. And again, the website is widowhoodworkshop.com. Whenever we do these workshops, in my heart and in my perspective, my target audience, and this may seem kind of strange, is not the widowed, but it's married couples. The widowed second.
Really?
That's my perspective.
Okay.
Now, that's not always the congregational perspective in promotion of the event,
right,
but that is my perspective. And the reason why is twofold. I've had people, as a matter of fact, in Alamosa, Colorado, I had this 80-year-old man with his 79-year-old wife came up to me at the end of the workshop, and he said, Dean, we want to tell you how much that we appreciated this workshop and how it's helped our marriage. Now, I thought by 80 years old, you'd have this stuff figured out, about marriage. And he said, last night we went home and we talked about what we liked about being married to one another. I've had other married couples come to me and say how much that they benefited as far as their perspective and attitude about their marriage because they had this Living with Loss workshop experience. And there's obviously a need to build better marriages in our culture. Statistics obviously are evidence of that. And so those people, I have a great interest in trying to reach with these Living with Loss workshops. The second reason I think that that's an important part of the demographic I want to reach, the married people, is because I would have liked to have had better preparation for the loss of my wife. Now, I'm not about to suggest, I'm not naive and suggest that you could totally prepare yourself for the loss of a beloved spouse. Okay, I'm not that crazy. But I will say that a little bit of preparation for anything is better than none. And like I'd said, I'd never read a book about widowhood before. Now, what was really odd, Robert, about me is I had studied a lot about grief. I'd taught classes about grief in like the Christian training school in Canton, Ohio. And I taught classes about the problem of human suffering and dealing with the difficulties of life. I went down that road in my studies and in my teaching ministry, but I had never read a single book about the loss of a spouse. I wish I had, because that's a whole different animal. The loss of a beloved spouse is a totally different animal. You know, when you stop to think about it, Robert, what other relationship in the Bible is described with those two words, one flesh? It's the only human relationship described like that.
Right.
Now, if you've spent your life, like you should have in your marriage, into the total giving of the total self for a total lifetime, that's what makes a magnificent marriage. If you've done that total giving of the total self for a total lifetime, and then it's gone. What a heart-crushing, what an earth-shaking thing that is to experience your life after that. There's such a profound emptiness that comes with that, because you've invested so much of your life into that, and that had become such a precious jewel of all of your relationships, and now it's gone. I think we could do a better job of preparing people for that experience.
Yeah.
Now, Robert, I don't know about you in your ministry, but I made it a practice in my ministry that I wouldn't officiate at wedding ceremonies without extensive premarital counseling.
Right. Same.
Now, not because I thought that premarital counseling would in every way help them in that transition from being single to being married.
Yeah.
I'm not that naive, but I'm hoping, it kind of helped a little bit.
Right.
So, what about people who are going to transition from being married to being widowed? That's a marital transition. Right. Single to married, I think it's wise to have premarital counseling. How about couples learning about widowhood? Because the only way a good marriage ends, there's only one way, and it's death.
Yeah.
And somebody being left behind. Now, a bad marriage can end in a whole lot of ugly ways, but there's only one way a good marriage ends. So here's something I thought about, and again, I never thought about this until after my wife passed away. If we're going to do a marriage seminar, I used to go to the Faulkner and Burkeen marriage enrichment seminars. My wife took me to two of them.
Oh.
And I loved the experiences. I loved Brother Burkeen and Brother Faulkner. They were awesome, and it really did help me to appreciate my marriage more and be a better husband. Now, isn't it interesting? I have not seen one yet that was in its advertisement about the topics it handled about transitioning from being married to being widowed. Isn't that a part of being married?
Wow.
Understanding that just like there was a I do to launch, there's also a heart-crushing end to a good marriage. And what are we doing to prepare those people for that? And so that's why I think it's really important to study about widowhood, especially about the impact that loss has in a person's life, how crazy it can make you feel and think and struggle.
I had never thought of that before, but it makes a lot of sense. You know, for a lot of us, I was talking with someone here yesterday who was saying, boy, they were speaking about their spouse had been very ill. The Lord answered their prayers affirmatively in asking for their spouse to be healed. Their spouse recovered, but the person said, I don't know what I would have done. And for many of us, it's just a nightmare. I don't know. To your point, preparation doesn't necessarily not make it a nightmare, but I'm just thinking about the way even that might focus me in my marriage now while my spouse still lives. There is an end point. If the Lord tarries, then one of us is going to die. How are we leaving this? How are we making each moment count while we have it now?
Yeah.
I could see where that would be good. Earlier, you used the analogy of widowhood as a gift. Now, albeit it was a bad gift. It was one you'd like to return, but you can't.
You're stuck with it.
You might like to re-gift, but you wouldn't dare do that to someone else. You want to elaborate on that? Loss, grief as a gift?
I just finished up in Mayhill, New Mexico, in southeast New Mexico, and the last study that we did with that church was about profiting from loss. Now, we can always profit from loss. I have a friend who prompted me to start thinking this way, asking this question: what can I learn from this? Especially when things go bad, when something happens that you didn't want to happen.
Right.
But how can I learn from this? If I learn from this, I profit from it, even though it might be a horrific loss. What can I learn from it? Well, I think there are some blessings. Number one, you're blessed with experience, albeit an ugly one,
Right.
a painful one, but you're blessed with an experience. Now, you didn't want the experience, but again, you're gifted it by life. Life gifts you blessings. Life gifts you burdens. And sometimes those burdens can be lifted, but sometimes they can't. Sometimes they're glued to you. They're stuck to you. Now, I think it's really important that we don't let that loss become our identity.
Sure.
Just like a person who's an amputee, that's not their identity. That's a part of their story. Just like a person who's been divorced. That's a part of their story, but that doesn't define them.
Yeah.
What defines us is our relationship with God. The fact that we exist in the image of God, we live in light of his likeness. If we're Christians, we're his by creation and redemption. That's our identity, our relationship with God. Not our age, not our marital status, not the color of our hair. We need to appreciate the fact that that's our identity. But there are times that life gives you things that actually you don't want, that you're stuck with, that you can use for his glory and the benefit of others. Who's going to be better able and effective in helping a person who's gone through agonizing loss? How about somebody who's gone through a very similar loss? Brother Batzel Barrett Baxter years ago wrote a book called When Life Tumbles In. And in that book, he made the observation that when we suffer our greatest burdens in life, we are not most blessed by people who on the sidelines give bland advice, but by those who've carried the same or similar burdens in their life. And I think, who can help a person with an addiction? How about a person who has successfully dealt with addiction?
Yeah.
And the same thing is true with the widowed. I think a great ministry role for the widowed is to be the ones who comfort, encourage, and direct those who are widowed. And that's why I encourage churches to start local, ongoing widowhood ministries. You've got a great one in Chester County, Tennessee, there with the Henderson Church. They're doing an awesome job. And I remember how that all started.
Yeah, good.
Roy Sharp and a couple of ladies from the Henderson Church drove up to Murray City, Tennessee. Population 650. They came up there, and we sat in the multi-purpose room, and I showed them a PowerPoint. I showed them some pictures, and I told them what we were doing in Crockett County, Tennessee, with a widowhood ministry. And then they took that home, and they tweaked it. And now, you have 40 plus, 50 plus people, and you're having people from the community come.
Yeah.
It's a great way of outreach to the community, because every community has widowed people.
Right.
And what faith-based group is ministering to the widowed? If the Lord's church becomes known as that church that really compassionately ministers to others. And see, I think the best core of that kind of a ministry is the widowed people. Yeah. They can use their widowhood as the hook to hook the interest of other people. Because they can say, hey, I've been there, I've suffered the loss, and I'm doing it now. I'm carrying the loss. I'm moving on in my life with the loss, not moving on from the loss. I'm moving on with the loss.
With it, sure. And
so there can be great blessings from that. Another thing I think that's valuable that a widowed person has because of that experience, I had a sister named Katrina in Lufkin, Texas, who texted me one day. It was on a Sunday afternoon, and she said, Dean, I think you would be proud of me today. I went to, after the Amen, I went to a couple of young women. Now, Katrina has been widowed twice. Both of them are preachers that she lost. So she said, I went to them after the Amen, and I talked to those young ladies and young mothers, and I said, girls, love your husbands. Cherish your marriage. Yeah. Be great mothers. Now, my suspicion is what she did in the way of coaching them was more powerful and effective than a guy with a suit behind a pulpit on a Sunday morning saying exactly the same thing.
Sure. Because
they knew what she had experienced in her life.
Yeah.
So that experience, though we don't want it, is a great gift to help other people. And when you help other people, God's glorified.
Yeah. I know that you're working so much to try and fill some of these shall we say, gaps, not to be critical, but just areas that perhaps we have not focused on in our ministry in the local church. But to your point, is very fertile ground, some ground that could be extremely beneficial for the local congregation and even outreach in the community. Widowhoodworkshop.com. People can they schedule or contact you to schedule maybe a widowhood workshop? Or
yes, they can.
Living with loss through that?
Yeah. Some churches choose to market it, if you will, as a widowhood workshop. I prefer to market it as a living with loss workshop.
I see.
Because everybody experiences loss.
Yeah.
And in these workshops, we don't just talk about the loss of a spouse. Typically, there are 6 sessions in these workshops. 2 of them zero in or target especially the loss of a spouse. But all 6 of them talk about loss and the impact of loss and how we should react to our losses in life. And we talk about all kinds of loss. We talk about the loss of a job that has morphed into maybe our identity and how that would shake us up. We talk about the loss of a house. You know, homes get flooded, homes get burned, homes get destroyed by tornadoes. Why is it that shakes us up so much? What is it about that loss? And we talk about the loss of a marriage by divorce. We talk about just all kinds of different losses that people can experience in life, because with loss comes grief. Yeah. And grief is not something, I appreciate H. Norman Wright in a book he wrote called The Reflections of a Grieving Spouse. He had lost his wife, and in the course of writing that book, he said, we live in a grief-illiterate culture. And he said, in a grief-illiterate culture where we don't even like to talk about the subject, it's really hard to grieve effectively. And I think he's right. Yeah. So what we do in these workshops is we talk really openly, and I try to avoid lecturing. I really do. I try to cultivate an atmosphere. Well, what we do is we openly discuss, and we engage in conversation about this, because the people who attend those things, they've had experiences I've not had, and they know some things I don't know. You know, I humbly admit that I don't know everything about anything, and nobody else does either.
That's right. Yeah.
Now, they may claim to, they may act like it, but they don't. And so, you know, we have discussions, and they're discussions about life, the nature of life, the unpredictability of life, the pain of life. We talk about love and how we get attached to people and things. We talk about marriage. We talk about loss, and navigating that very difficult time after life. When you're so messed up and you wonder, am I going crazy? 3 weeks after my wife passed away, I was sitting in my house, my empty house, all by myself. This was 3 weeks afterwards. This was the middle of January of 2014. And I did something I've never done before and I've never done since. I talked to myself. Some people do that a lot, but I don't. And I just said this out loud. It was like a little kid without a filter between his brain and his lips, and you know how stuff just comes out? Yeah. You've got kids. You know about that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I live that every day.
Yeah, okay. As a matter of fact, when my wife and I taught the 2s and 3s and the 4s and 5s on Wednesday night, I learned stuff about their parents I didn't want to know, man.
Yes.
Yeah.
Pray for my kids' Bible class teachers, but anyway, it's a different story.
Yeah, but anyway, I was sitting there, and it just came out of me real quick, spontaneously. What's wrong with me? Oh. I was just so messed up. I felt it inside. You know, everybody's got a thinker and a feeler. And man, that thinker and feeler, they weren't on the same page. They were both in overdrive. Yeah. And I was just really, really struggling. Oh. And so what I did at that point was I thought, well, if I'm really struggling, what I need to do is I need to go where everybody goes for answers. And I went to the internet. So I sat down with my laptop and I started searching for help, especially ministries for the widowed. And you know what I found, Robert? Virtually nothing. Wow. And that was what my daughter would call my come to Jesus moment. Oh. That's when I thought, man, somebody ought to do something.
Good.
We need to start doing a better job of providing resources and creating ministries to help widowed people. And that's really how the Widowhood Workshop came to be. Sure. It's my family's passion project. All 3 of my daughters, my 3 sons-in-law, my 5 grandchildren, they are all involved in this ministry. Every year in July, we have a nationwide retreat, and we welcome widowed people no matter what their age is, either gender, doesn't matter what their religious affiliation is. This past year, this past month in July, we had 158 widowed people there from 15 different states. Wow. And it's really neat to see them assimilate, because what happens a lot of times with spousal loss especially is we end up losing a lot of our social network. There are studies that have been done about this, and the typical spouse who loses a beloved spouse loses 75% of their social network. Now, a lot of that's because they don't know what to do with you.
Right.
And sometimes we make people uncomfortable because they don't know what to do with us. So what do? We back off. That's what we human beings do. When it comes to feeling threatened or the possibility of discomfort, we back away. So these people are a lot of times neglected. Well, if we can get them to assimilate and connect with others, I have a private Facebook group. You can only be a part of it, number one, if you're a member of the Church of Christ, and number two, if you've lost your spouse. There's over 350 people in that group. They're from all over the country. And what's really neat is they're ministering to one another. They are creating a kind of support group. Now, a lot of them will never meet one another this side of heaven, but a lot of them meet at that nationwide widowhood retreat we have in Middle Tennessee. But helping them to build a community, not a clique, but a community within the broader God's family, will really help them with their life, because having somebody that knows a little bit about your walk, never say, I know how you feel, by the way, to a widowed person. You might get slapped or punched in the face.
Well, you asked for it. No.
Yeah, that is the number one thing. If I were to list one thing that widowed people hate to have somebody say, it's that, I know how you feel, because you couldn't possibly.
No.
But we say that, it's, again, a cultural courtesy.
Yes.
We try to verbally empathize with them that way. But I'd never say that, and I don't think any widowed person would ever say that to another widowed person, but you can sure relate to that other person a whole lot better because of that thing you have in common that you don't want, and that's loss. And that is something in common that causes people to assimilate, and they can help one another.
Good.
So that's part of what the ministry does.
That is always in July?
Yes.
Okay. Widowhoodworkshop.com. They can find out when the next one is next year in July.
Third weekend in July.
Okay, great. And I know we've got some people in Henderson who just look forward to it all year long, and it's such a blessing to their lives. So thank you.
It's all about encouragement. It's a positive thing. It's not a negative thing. It's very uplifting. It's not threatening at all. We've had people come who had just lost their spouses within just a few months, and we've had people who have been experiencing widowhood for over 20 years who attend.
If so, we're talking primarily to preachers. Just some brief advice. I mean, let's say that there's a fellow listening here, and he's thinking, okay, you know what? I've never walked this road of widowhood, but I'm realizing I've neglected widows and widowers in my ministry. What should he do? I mean, we hear a lot about what he shouldn't do. You know, don't go and tell him. Don't go and tell him I know how you feel or whatever. What can he do to help the people in his congregation? As the minister, as the preacher.
I referenced my come to Jesus moment. That same night, after I sat there with a computer and couldn't find any ministries to help the widowed, it dawned on me, I did not even know how many widowed people there were in the church where I'd preached for 32 years. Now, if you'd asked me, how many kids do you have? You know, what's your youth program like? I could have gone to the computer and kicked out a list of all the kids. With a pictorial directory and a yellow notepad. And I started flipping through the directory and listing every person. That was the first time in my life as a preacher, a local preacher, for over 40 years that I'd ever done that. I think that's the place to start.
Wow.
How many widowed sisters and brothers do you have in your church family where you're preaching? I think that's a place to start right there.
That's a good idea.
A next thing I think that would be good to do is talk to the church leadership, whatever you have for a church leadership there. Talk to them about how obviously in Scripture God has a special place in his heart for the widowed. And begin to brainstorm creatively about what can we do to minister to these people who are struggling in a unique way. And I think brainstorming with them and including some of the key widowed people that you feel like are more verbal than the other ones, get their input about, hey, what can we do in the way of creating a local widowhood ministry? And I think that's very important. I think another thing that we need to do is just individually cultivate a relationship with them so that there's transparent conversation between you and them, so that you find out how they really feel. I'll give you an example of an experience I had with a widowed lady. This was several years after she had had her husband pass away, and I'd even moved away from the town where I'd lived for 33 years. And I came back, and then when I came back, I wanted to visit with her, so I went to visit with her. And at the end of the visit, I found out that she had a light that wasn't working.
Oh.
And so before I left, I said, hey, Marlene, I want to check about this light that's not working. She said, oh, don't worry about it, Dean. It's fine. And I said, no, I really want to do this. And she said, no, don't worry about it. I said, Marlene, if you don't let me look at this light, I'm going to move in with you. She said, here is the stool.
Wow.
All she needed was a light bulb changed.
Right.
Now, how many people that were worshiping with her every Sunday knew that she needed a light bulb changed? Mm-hmm. She had no business getting up there herself. You know, there are just all kinds of things like that. I have heard of a suggestion I thought was really good. Don't ever go and visit a widowed person without a little toolbox and some light bulbs in your car.
Okay, sure.
Because you might be able to do something for them right then and there.
That's a good idea.
And I think there's things that you can do around the house even. And I think it's really important. Here's something not to do. Don't go to a widowed person and say, what can I do for you? Do it differently. Start looking, start investigating. You know that word visit in James 1:27 is about looking over and inspecting for the purpose of trying to address the needs. Well, find ways of finding out about what these people need, and then just go ahead and do it, and don't even ask for permission. There was a guy whose wife was dying in the Cleveland Clinic, and he said to me as we were sitting there in the snack bar and we were taking a break, he said, Dean, I wish people would quit asking me, what can I do for you? He said, I just wish they would see what needs to be done and do it. Just do it. Whenever we ask somebody, what can I do for you? Where's the burden? It's on the person that you've asked the question to. Because now they've got to have the ability to figure out what you can do for them. So lighten their burden by finding out what is it that they need. And there are ways to find out. You know people that know them. And you can observe. Don't be a typical male, guys. You know, be observant for a change. I'm the least observant person on planet Earth. I have to really intentionally tell myself, be observant, watch, keep your eyes open, keep your ears open. But I think starting local widowed ministries is just really important because you get them, once you get them assimilating, then they start talking with one another, and then you start finding out, things start surfacing about what the needs really are.
Right.
But I think we got to remember what they've lost is a relationship. They've lost a part of their life. That door's been slammed shut, it's locked, they're never going to be able to go through that door again. What we have to do is realize that relational connection is something they're going to struggle with day in and day out, and they need relationships, people who care about them and people who will not exclude them just because they're going to be an uneven number in a coupled world. You got 3 couples going out. Let me tell you about my best friend here at the end of this podcast. She was divorced, and ugly divorce. And her best friend came to her and said, boy, I really hate that I can't invite you over when I have a dinner party, because if I did that, it'd be an uneven number.
Oh, no.
That was her best friend that said that. Not an enemy, not a friend, not a Facebook friend, an Instagram follower. It was her best friend that said that. And we live in a coupled world. People who are widowed are social misfits in a coupled world. And we've got to recognize that, and we've got to help them to feel more comfortable, because there's a lot of social awkwardness that goes with being widowed, and helping them, like going to church. Don't ever let a widowed person sit by themselves in worship. Have somebody who actually is looking for, have 1 or 2 people, depending on the size of the congregation, looking for widowed people. Whenever they come in, make sure that they're never sitting alone. Especially if a young couple or a young couple with a child or 2 sit with a widowed person, that really pumps them up, makes them feel good.
Good. Oh, man, those are great practical suggestions. Tell us about your books before we close it down today. And these would be, tell us for whom maybe you wrote these books as well as you're talking about these.
The first book I wrote is called When the End Comes, and it's a very brief book. It's only 50 plus pages. Mm-hmm. It's even in 13-point type, which makes it really easy for those of us who are getting older. It also has wider margins. It's really easy on the eyes.
I love it.
When the End Comes is the first book that I wrote. And then after I wrote that book, I thought, boy, there needs to be more addressed on this subject. And so I wrote a second book, and it's called Before the End Comes, because I wanted to help married couples understand what would really be good for them to build in their lives individually and also as a couple prior to the time one of them is left behind. Mm-hmm. And so the second book is called Before the End Comes. The hardest book I ever wrote was the last one, and it's called After the End Comes. And in that book, I talk about a lot of things, some of which I have never seen written about before. I've not been able to find things about this subject, but I felt like it was really important to address. For instance, there's a chapter in this book about male-female relationships after loss.
Oh.
It's an awkward thing. It's a really awkward situation, male-female relationships after loss, especially when you've exclusively kept yourself to that one flesh relationship for so long. It can be very strange, male-female relationships after loss. One chapter in this book is about sex after loss. Where do we read about that? You know, after you've lost your spouse, that doesn't mean you've lost your sexual drive. Mm-hmm. So how do you deal with that? And then also marriage after loss is another chapter in that book. And again, that's a very complicated thing. The beginning of those three chapters is the one, male-female relationships after loss. I started that chapter with a sentence with one word and a period. The sentence is a one-word sentence. It's complicated, period. It's very complicated. Male-female relationships after loss, very complicated. And so I wrote these books to help people who are married as well as help people who are widowed. And as a matter of fact, I have had a church even use the book Before the End Comes in a married class to promote study and discussion with married couples.
That's great. Yeah.
And those books can be purchased through Amazon.
Okay. And you've got them linked on the front page of widowhoodworkshop.com as well.
Yes.
Good. Mm-hmm. Okay. Paperback and Kindle versions are available there, and definitely check those out. This has been good. It's a hard subject to discuss, and maybe one that we avoid because we feel awkward about it or because there's grief and loss associated with it. But at the same time, I just know what a blessing the widows and widowers of every congregation I've ever been privileged to work with have been to me as a preacher. They're usually very encouraging people.
They are.
They're very selfless people. And I know that when I've had the opportunities to go by and visit them or to help them in whatever way I can, which I want to do better at, especially after our conversation today, I always leave feeling like I've been the one who's benefited the most. And they just have a way of doing that.
I can relate to that. I have that history of ministry as well with them. Some of your biggest cheerleaders and boosters are the widowed people.
Yeah. And
I think a lot of that comes from their perspective having been primed or matured by their loss.
Yes.
You just see things. I see a lot of things so much more clearly now than I ever did, Robert. Mm-hmm. Man, there are some things, I see how little some things matter now.
Oh, wow.
And I also see how much some things matter now. And a lot of that comes as one of the gifts or the byproducts of loss.
Right. Well, thank you for using your gift, as you say, to bless the brotherhood, bless the church, and to encourage us all. We really
Could I say one more thing?
Please do.
I want to go on record of saying this.
Good.
I hate widowhood.
Good.
I hate it with a passion. Just like a cancer patient hates the cancer, the disease. An amputee hates the fact that they've lost their limb. And, for some of us, there's no prosthesis. Yeah. So it's a really difficult struggle. You could hate a part of your life without hating your life.
Sure.
Because that you hate is not your identity. Again, what your identity is your relationship with God, whether by creation or redemption. So sometimes we have to struggle with things that we just don't like. And frankly, if we're honest, we even hate in our life.
Yeah.
Just like being divorced, going through that experience. You'd hate it. God hates it.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and the people who well, all things work together for good. Hey,
Oh.
that doesn't mean everything in life has to be good in some form or fashion. In fact, it's not going to be.
Yeah, and it's not going to feel good either.
No.
There's a bunch of stuff that's going to feel bad.
Yeah. Don't be a Job's friend.
Yeah, exactly.
Don't do that.
Well, wait a minute. We need to do another podcast on that one.
Okay, all
Because
right,
I want to
good.
defend those three friends, okay?
Hey, they showed up.
That's one of the things.
They were there.
They did more than show up.
They were there.
Yeah, save that for another podcast.
Okay.
Put that in your notes,
All
okay?
right, good. That's
Okay.
good. All right, you heard it here first. Brother Dean's going to come back. We're going to talk about Job's friends.
Yeah, okay. Sounds good to me.
Thank you, brother, for coming on. We appreciate it a lot.
You're welcome.
Thank all of you for being a part of this edition of Preachers in Training. Remember, every Thursday, thelightnetwork.tv is where you can find this podcast. Till then, let's go preach the word.